Welcome to our deep dive. This time, it's Mr. Antony Comedy, a comedic play from the 1690s England. I'm so ready to find out how this play uses humor to poke fun at all those social norms from way back then. We're looking at excerpts from the original play itself, and I think we're going to find some surprises in here.
What really gets me is how a play written over 300 years ago can still be funny to us today. Using humor to point out all the little weird things about society, it's kind of timeless, don't you think?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. Okay, so Mr. Antony Comedy introduces us to this cast of characters, and their names are as colorful as their personalities. We've got Antony, he's our young guy figuring out this whole growing up thing. And then there's his rival, Cudden. He seems to be competing with Antony for pretty much everything. I mean, ladies, obviously, but just about anything that moves, really.
And even the smaller characters have these great names, like Goody Winifred. It's almost like the playwright wanted us to know right away that this was going to be a comedy.
Right. And then there are these scheming friends, Plot and Art, always stirring things up. And we can't forget Pedagogue the tutor. He seems to be fighting a losing battle with Antony, who has zero interest in academics. And of course, there are the two women at the center of all of this. Well, maybe quadrangle is a better word for it. Isabella and Philadelphia.
It really does feel like their names are a hint about all the craziness that's about to happen.
Speaking of craziness, there's this one scene that really stuck with me. Antony does this aside to the audience where he confesses that he's terrified of commitment, all while he's pretending to be head over heels for Isabella. It's brilliant dramatic irony. Do you think it's more about showing us who Antony really is? Or is it a commentary on how much pressure there was to get married back then?
That's a really good question. I think it's both. On the one hand, we see that Anthony's not the confident Romeo he pretends to be, but it also kind of hints at all the things society expected from young men who were old enough to marry. Marriage wasn't just about love, it was about family connections, who gets the money, and fitting in with everyone else.
It makes you think. That pressure to be like everyone else. I wonder if that's something people still feel today, even if the details are different.
Oh, absolutely. Wanting to belong, to be what everyone expects you to be. That's a struggle that never goes away. And this play captures that struggle perfectly, using humor.
Now, another thing that really cracked me up was the way education is shown in the play. Antony just blatantly refuses to learn anything. And then he says he'd rather break Priscian's head 1,000 times than admit he did something wrong. I laughed out loud. It felt weirdly relatable, even now.
It does, doesn't it? That line about Priscian, he was this famous grammarian. It's like Anthony saying he'd rather smash the rules of language than just own up to what he did. It's this really clever way of showing that he hates authority and would rather cause trouble than study.
It makes you wonder if the playwright was taking a shot at the whole education system back then. Was it maybe a comment on how rigid the classes were? Or maybe they were criticizing how out of touch what they were teaching was. Like, it wasn't relevant to what young people actually cared about.
It's definitely possible. Remember, this was a time when people were starting to think differently about everything, challenging the old ways of thinking, and education was right in the middle of all that. So yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if the playwright was using comedy to quietly question the way things were.
So even though it's hilarious on the surface, there's this deeper message about society hidden in there, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes Mr. Antony Comedy so brilliant. It makes us laugh and makes us think about the world around us.
All right, let's talk about the duel. It has to be one of the most ridiculous, side-splitting scenes I've ever read in a play. Antony comes out in full armor with a longbow, saying he can hit Cudden from 100 yards away.
Yeah.
Pure slapstick. But it also feels like the playwright is making fun of what it meant to be a man and a hero back then.
I agree. It plays with all our expectations about what a duel should be. Instead of these two guys showing off their sword skills and how brave they are, we get this clumsy mess of misplaced confidence and pure terror.
And poor Cudden. Thinking the musicians are assassins just makes the whole thing even crazier. It's a good reminder that even when things are supposed to be serious, people can still be totally ridiculous.
Yeah. While the duel gives us that over-the-top kind of humor, I think the real satire, the stuff that makes you think, is in the play's love quadrangle. You have Isabella and Philadelphia, the two women all the guys are after, but they're not just sitting around waiting for someone to pick them.
You're so right. They're actually pretty sly and manipulative. I love that scene where they make Antony and Cudden think they've switched who they like. It's such a good twist. It shows how smart they are and how they can outsmart the guys who think they're so much smarter than them.
It's almost like the playwright is challenging those old ideas about men and women back then. These women aren't just waiting around for someone to pick them, they're making their own choices, using their wit and charm to get what they want, this whole crazy courtship game.
And the way they talk to each other, they're so sharp. It's obvious they see right through all the men's fancy words and pretending to be something they're not.
Which brings us to plot and art. Those master manipulators who are always lurking around, ready to take advantage of any situation. What do you think their role is in all of this?
They're like parasites, feeding off of everyone else's chaos. And they don't care who they target. They even trick Pedagogue, the tutor.
Yeah.
And he's supposed to be the voice of reason, the authority figure.
That's interesting. Do you think they're just there for laughs? Or is the playwright trying to say something deeper about society with these characters?
I think it's more than just laughs. The fact that they can take advantage of anyone, rich or poor. It suggests that maybe the playwright was commenting on how people could kind of bend the rules back then. It's like they represent this darker side of human nature, the kind that gets ahead by taking advantage of other people's bad luck.
And don't forget, this play was written during a time when things were changing a lot. There was a lot of social unrest and political uncertainty. Maybe plot and art represent that anxiety people were feeling, like this feeling that everything was changing, that even people in power could be tricked and cheated.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're like a warning sign. Be careful of people who promise you easy solutions or quick wins, because they might just be looking out for themselves.
Exactly. And the things they do often backfire, making everything even more chaotic and confusing. Like that scene where they convinced the musicians to rob Antony and Cutton. It was supposed to be a harmless prank, but it ends up being really humiliating for those guys.
It's like the playwright is saying, hey, look how easily the rich and powerful can lose everything. It reminds us that it's who you are, not what you have, that really matters.
And that scene is particularly interesting because it shows us how people were worried about class and social mobility back then. England was changing so fast, economically and socially, and the old ways of doing things were being challenged.
So, like we said before, it's hilarious on the surface. But underneath all the jokes, there's a deeper message about society.
Exactly. The playwright wants us to think about power, about how fragile social structures can be, and all the crazy ways we try to navigate relationships.
And then there's Antony, always going on about how much he hates French fashion and words. It seems like a small thing, but it actually says a lot about what people were worried about back then.
Oh, absolutely. England and France had this huge rivalry, politically and culturally. And after the Restoration, people started getting really nervous about French influence, especially among the upper classes.
So when Antony complains about French words sneaking into English, he's not just being a grumpy old man. He's reflecting a real fear that English culture was being eroded, like their identity was being threatened by this foreign influence.
Precisely. It reminds us that even things as seemingly insignificant as clothes and language can become really important symbols of who we are as a culture and a nation.
It makes you wonder if we still have those anxieties today. Maybe not about French fashion specifically, but definitely about how globalization is making everything kind of the same, and how that affects our own unique cultures.
For sure. And that's what makes Mr. Antony comedy so fascinating. It takes these timeless anxieties and shows them to us in a way that's funny and makes us think.
Okay, so even with all the chaos and craziness, the play does end with things kind of settling down. Everyone finds someone, and order is restored. But even in that happy ending, there's a little bit of irony, don't you think?
I agree. The last scene kind of leaves us with this feeling like maybe this order isn't as solid as it seems. It's like the playwright is winking at us saying, hey, these characters might end up in the same ridiculous situations all over again.
It reminds us that life just keeps repeating itself. People don't really change that much. And even the most carefully crafted social rules can fall apart when we're being our messy selves.
And that, I think, is the brilliance of Mr. Antony comedy. It makes us laugh, but it also acknowledges that relationships are complicated and that society is always changing.
It feels like the play is kind of walking this line. It makes fun of the characters, but it also really gets why they're so messed up. It makes me wonder if it's more than just a snapshot of what life was like back then.
I've been thinking the same thing. Is Mr. Antony comedy just about those specific anxieties from 17th century England? Or are these characters dealing with something that's, more human, something we all go through? The way they bumble around in these ridiculous situations, wanting love, wanting to be somebody, wanting to belong. It feels so familiar, even though it was written centuries ago.
Yeah, we've all had those times when we're trying so hard to impress someone or fit in with everyone else. And we just end up making total fools of ourselves.
Exactly. Or that job interview where you're not making any sense. You can't stop talking. The play nails those moments of, like, social awkwardness.
Yeah.
And it does it in such a funny way.
It's like the playwright is saying, it's okay to be a little messed up. You don't have to be perfect all the time. Actually, it's usually when we're being our most awkward selves that we're being the most real.
And there's something really freeing about that. Instead of trying to be this perfect person that doesn't exist, we can just laugh at our mistakes, learn from them, and connect with other people because we all mess up sometimes.
I think that's what makes this play so timeless. It reminds us that even though we're all different, we share these experiences. We all want to be loved and accepted. We all mess up. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just laugh about it.
So to everyone listening, I really think you should check out the whole play. Mr. Antony Comedy isn't just some old dusty book. It's a glimpse into what it means to be human, and it's hilarious. It reminds us that laughter can bring people together, help us understand ourselves, and find joy even when life gets crazy.
I've loved digging into this play with you. And even though we're at the end of our deep dive, I have a feeling Mr. Antony Comedy is going to stick with us. Its wit, its wisdom, and just how relevant it still is. Until next time, keep exploring, keep laughing, and keep embracing all the beautiful messiness of being human.